those of you who are not familiar with Jeremy yet, Jeremy has provided counsel to PSEF, I think from the very early days of PSEF for founding documents, etc., and provides ongoing counsel in various ways. And today he's here to share with us information about the Inflation Reduction Act's impacts on tax credits, and particularly how those renewable energy tax credit changes affect projects like ours, community ownership, etc. And he is particularly well positioned to give us this info and maybe answer some questions and have discussion with us afterwards, because he has served and maybe is still serving on the National Renewable Energy Tax Credit Working Group, advising the Treasury, the IRS, and DOE on Inflation Reduction Act implementation. Jeremy, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us. And then Jeremy, are you good with us just asking questions at the end, or do you want to have people ask you questions in the middle?
Let's hold questions, I think.
Deal.
I think you could ask 26 questions at each point, and better to get the full overview, I think.
Good,
All
good.
right.
So if you have questions, guys, pop it in the chat and then we'll get to them all afterwards.
Perfect.
Thanks, Jeremy.
You bet. And thanks, Allie, for the intro. And thank you all for your ridiculously good work. Let's see if that works. Is that, you're seeing in presentation view now? Awesome. Thanks, Crystal, for the thumbs up. Oh, and of course it went one too far. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the everything that Allie just shared. This is largely the meat and potatoes of presentation I made to NREL and RMI's Solar Equity Innovation Network a few weeks ago. There have not been substantive updates from the IRS on the tax credit side. So I think we're okay for where we are, but do inventory your questions as we go. I do have to say that even though I am PSEF's lawyer and legal counsel and legal counsel to Cooperative Energy Futures, and I think that's it of the folks on the call, that what I'm sharing is educational info. So, you can't be a lawyer without having a disclaimer that this is that if you have questions about your specific project, specific circumstances, that we should talk and then see if I can provide actual binding legal advice or give you more information at least. So I think it's really helpful. Most of us are focused on the Inflation Reduction Act in this space, but certainly the broader clean tech world, we see a lot of discussion about funding that has come from the CHIPS Act, which is largely focused on manufacturing competitiveness, but does have some clean energy manufacturing components. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Jobs Act, which was passed by the last Congress, and the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to, of course, be speaking a great deal about the Inflation Reduction Act specifically. The reason why there's an asterisk is, as we'll describe here in a second, the original scoring of the budget implications of the Inflation Reduction Act were laid out this way, with 5 departments getting the bulk of either appropriation or authorization. So Ag, Energy, and the EPA. There was a lot of work on prescription drug coverage and other key pieces of the Health and Human Services budget and programs. And then, something I've despised for years, and now, of course, am a tax lawyer, so I despise myself even more, is the use of the tax code and tax credits rather than direct investment, except that with an asterisk. So you'll see that $345 billion of the Inflation Reduction Act, the majority of funds are through tax credits. But describing it as a dollar amount is misleading because it's an open appropriation in lots of ways. We can all think of it as a challenge between now and 2032 to jam as many projects as possible into the tax credit environment. And you'll see why I'm going to become an advocate of doing so in about 10 minutes, I think. This 345 million, so this is the scoring of the Congressional Budget Office. The Joint Tax Committee came out about 3 months ago and said, this is wrong. We believe that the true cost is going to be doubled. And now we believe the true cost is actually going to be tripled or quadrupled. Why? Because the demand for projects, particularly solar projects, is through the roof, as it should be. And so somebody who, one of the things Allie didn't describe in my background, some of you know that I worked for the White House back in 2009, 10, 11, trying to get a federal climate bill passed. You know, I'm overworked right now, as we all are, and happily so, because we have this decade to deploy as much federal funds as possible with no limitation, unless Congress were to interject something, which I don't see at this point. Really no limitation on our ability to access many, if not, well, not all, but the bulk and the vast majority of these tax credits. So now is the time. So that the direct funding, $178 billion was cash for clean energy, and then 43 billion in residential consumer-based, largely tax credits. So things like the electric vehicle tax credits, the residential solar and other energy improvements. And then this initially scored 173 billion of commercial credits. That 173 billion is going to go through the roof. The direct funding, I do want to just describe and sort of put in context what Mac was describing about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and that $27 billion is here as appropriations. And if we want to talk about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, I helped get the Minnesota Green Bank established this last session, and I've been working with our state on mobilizing as much funds as possible. And so happy to talk more about that, but just to put a little pin, Mac talked about the urgency. So the NOFO for the 14 billion National Climate Investment Fund, I think NCIF, and the 6 billion CCIA funds, that was released on Friday, and the application deadlines will be October 12th. So expect to need to move fast on that front. But I'm going to focus on the commercial tax credit world. And this is kind of blinding, right? You don't need to know all these pieces, but just know that at least 11, and there are 10 here. So yes, I'm a project finance guy who can't count. At least 11 significant energy tax credits were either amended and enlarged or extended, or brand new credits. And so you can see why so much of why I'm talking about this as being an open appropriation from the federal government. For our purpose, we really care about the Section 48 energy investment tax credit. And the technologies that are considered, energy properties include everything from geothermal to actual ground source, because our ground source heat, which is not geothermal, geothermal is deeper, waste energy recovery, energy storage, et cetera. But as People's Solar Energy Fund, what we care about is solar power. So solar thermal is also included. But when we talk about the Section 48 credit, I'm going to talk about it as solar. But for instance, energy storage, which most of you probably know, if you all don't know, energy storage used to not have its own standalone credit, but and require being charged 100% from solar to qualify as energy property for the credit. Now it has its own property, or its own definition as eligible property. So y'all are familiar with the kind of pre-investment or Inflation Recovery Act life cycle of sort of ride that solar coaster and the wind coaster of extensions of the production tax credit, and then sunsets, and then extensions and sunsets. And what it looked like before the Inflation Reduction Act most recently was we would now be in the world of a 10% credit for solar projects going forward. Now we're talking about 30% permanently, well, quasi-permanently through 2032. So really, really grateful for not only that extension, but also for what we're about to dive into as kind of deeper dive additional credits that really recognize the community development that we all care about. So to pause for a second. Solar, for the purposes of the investment tax credit, is bifurcated into two different kinds of projects. One tier are those projects that are 1 megawatt and larger AC, and those that are smaller than 1 megawatt. So not 1 megawatt, but smaller than 1 megawatt. So 999 kilowatts AC nameplate capacity. I'm going to talk about those larger projects that meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship guidelines. I'm not going to talk about what those prevailing wage and apprenticeship guidelines are. They're actually not terribly difficult to meet. But for those of you that are developing larger projects, know that the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements need attention and not only include construction, but also operation and maintenance of the projects. I'm going to talk about projects that are smaller than a megawatt. The reason why they're bifurcated, though, is projects that don't pay prevailing wage or apprenticeship receive a 6% ITC, investment tax credit amount. The two projects in teal you see there highlighted, those two tiers automatically get a 30% investment tax credit as the base credit amount. And I'll walk through that in a little bit more, but you probably already know this, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So those smaller projects don't need to meet the prevailing wage requirements and are automatically at that 30%. So I guess I described that. All right, I want to make sure that we're all operating from the same basis on what a tax credit is, and then drill into some of the key changes around transferability and direct pay. And then we'll talk about the bonus credits, I believe. So a 30% project is based on basis. And I'm going to talk about basis as a $1 million project cost. There are sometimes when you can elect basis as via cost basis, which is by far the most popular method. You can also use a fair market value basis that's more complicated, but you can get there. And there are times when, for instance, in high cost of power states like Hawaii, or high incentive markets like the District of Columbia, it is worth thinking about stepping up that basis to the higher fair market value basis with an appraisal. But I'm just going to talk about $1 million project cost, where a 30% tax credit means 1 million times 30 equals $300,000 as a credit. So let's talk about for-profit solar owners. So I'm just going to talk about Cooperative Energy Futures, which is a Minnesota cooperative taxed as an LLC, so a for-profit for this purpose. If a for-profit puts solar on their own building, they can claim, or their own property, that owner can claim the federal tax credit at 30% of the project cost. So it'll be a $300,000 credit. That credit for for-profit solar owners is still a non-refundable credit, which means you have to have $300,000 of a tax bill to offset in order to turn that $300,000 credit into actual money. You can also accelerate the depreciation deduction, which can be as much or more than the value of the investment tax credit itself. So for-profit solar owners that have a tax credit, a federal tax credit, it's often worth it for them to own their own solar and to take the credit and the depreciation. For a for-profit solar owner on someone else's business, so for instance, CEF owning a 990 kW project on the roof of an apartment, or a parking ramp, the third party for-profit solar owner will lease the roof. Of course, you guys all know this, and will take advantage of the $300,000 non-refundable credit and the depreciation deduction. So this is kind of the traditional partnership flip or partnership investment that preceded the Inflation Reduction Act, and not much has changed about this structure. But there's a new option now for a for-profit solar owner on someone else's building, land, business, where that building owner cannot claim the federal tax credit because they don't have the tax bill to offset. The owner of the solar system can sell the tax credit to an outside party for cash. This is known as a 6418 transfer. This is remarkable because it used to be that under a traditional partnership flip, it still is, that you have to close on the tax investor's interest in the solar system before the system is put into service. So the best example I could have of this is a client who got a grant from the state to build all sorts of systems that had to be turned on by September 30th. We closed on their tax credit investment on September 28th. In the middle of a hurricane, they couldn't activate those systems until we closed. So we closed Wednesday afternoon. In the middle of the leading edge of the hurricane on Thursday, they went around and activated most systems. On Friday, during the winds and rain, they activated their last dozen and a half systems, but they couldn't turn on the systems, literally just flip the switch, until they had closed on the tax credit investment. Now, they could have, if they were just selling the credit to an outside party, they could have actually activated the systems. And then they actually have until the tax filing deadline of the next year, so think September, including extensions, to actually sell the tax credit to a third party, which means you can finish a project, not need to close on the tax credit investment, and then go shop an active system to try to get someone to buy that credit. As you all know, it's going to be a lot easier to underwrite and get someone to say yes to buying a credit for a system that has been active for several months, is producing electricity, you can measure its success, etc. But you can't transfer depreciation out. And it has to be for cash. And so we're seeing about 85 cents on the dollar, 90 cents on the dollar as the market. In fact, I've seen 85-cent term sheets being signed now. The Inflation Reduction, or the IRS has not finalized the rules. They proposed the rules, but we probably won't see final execution and closing on those tax credit purchases until after those rules are finalized, probably in September or October. But this is a nice way to monetize your ITC. There are reasons it's an advantage to keep depreciation in the project and not transfer it out, which you can't. But like everything, there's no free ride. I don't want to get into the details here. There are certainly some deep considerations to work through, but it's a good option going forward. I will say that the one thing that the IRS didn't, or the Congress didn't do, that Joe Manchin apparently, as I've heard, is the one who said we can't make this change, is I was hoping that they would increase the number of investors that could take advantage of the investment tax credit, but they did not change the passive loss rules. I'm not going to get into it. I'll try to post a link to an article I've written about it. And when I get the memo finished very soon that y'all can read, you can read about the limitations of people who can actually turn the tax credit into cash, because not all of us with a basic federal tax bill can actually monetize the solar tax credit, sadly. So shifting gears to nonprofit solar owners, which is a large number of those of you on this Zoom meeting. Just like the old partnership flip, a for-profit solar owner comes and leases the roof, has to close on that investment before the system is activated, and then claims the credit and some of the depreciation benefit, or as much as they can. But now, Section 6417, the direct pay, which is technically known as the elective payment, this is transformational. And I give credit to Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota for driving this for quite a while. And I know, for instance, well, I know some members of the PSEF world have been advocating for a very long time for this. Nonprofit applicable entities, so tax exempt entities, states, cities, local governments, tribes, rural electric cooperatives, excuse me, can claim the federal tax credit as a direct payment. So a 2023 year project that's closed in 2023 and placed in service can be claimed for that tax credit as a direct payment from the IRS. This is totally transformational. I'm going to also talk about, now that we have talked about the how to monetize the credit, let's talk about the size of the credit itself, because there are some bonuses that you, I'm sure, have heard about. So we talked about focusing on the base credit of the 30%. And so here's what the stackers look like, right? You've seen this generally, that energy communities bonus can be added, the domestic content bonus can be added, and then the low income bonus credit, either the 10 or 20% can be added. So just going one by one here, the energy communities bonus is available for projects that are located in, and I believe it's also for category 1, it's the same as 2 or 3, which is that 51% of the, or more than 50% of the nameplate capacity of the project is located in a brownfield community, or in a brownfield, excuse me, with a definition that we can look up. I'm having a brain fart about the definition right now, but a second is a statistical area, meaning that has either basically 1 out of every 600 people employed are employed in the fossil fuel world, or 25% or more of the tax revenue comes from fossil fuels in that region. So think the western slope of Colorado, like natural gas country. And the are in a coal closure community with a closed coal mine since 2000, or a closed power plant, coal power plant since 2010. In these cases, and some of it, it's kind of a quick either or, pretty easy to see based on the map that's available, that gets updated every May, I believe it is, but don't hold me to it, April or May, and has been finalized for 2023 projects. It's pretty clear, are we in an energy communities project? I'm working with folks on the Navajo reservation in Arizona and New Mexico, and both Arizona and New Mexico territories are, I think, category 3 here. So I'm going to get the 10% energy communities bonus, most likely. The domestic content bonus. This bonus, I think, is best described, before I go into the details, as a true bonus, not an entitlement. I think in 2023, we're going to see very few projects meet the requirements of the domestic content bonus. Admittedly, per the Treasury Assistant Secretary responsible for implementing the IRA. It's quite complicated. You not only need to meet the requirements that all structural steel and iron has to be made in the US, but pardon the formatting goofiness there, but 40% of all manufactured products have to be either 100% US made or deemed to be US made. And it is really complicated to get to the nuts and bolts, literally the nuts and bolts and adhesives of adding up to what counts here. I'm happy to sometime over several adult beverages is probably the best way to hack our way through the this definition. It is mind warping. So, you know, marijuana will be legal in Minnesota at some point, and it probably will need some in order to stay relaxed enough to make it all the way through the regs at this point. The good news is for developers, is that the burden is on the manufacturers. But in applying for the domestic content bonus, you do have to certify as the taxpayer claimant, even if you're the nonprofit taking direct pay. You have to certify that to the best of your knowledge under penalty of perjury, that the components have met the direct domestic content requirement. So as a risk-averse guy myself, I ain't doing it unless I'm absolutely positively sure and have not only got the certification from the manufacturers, but have actually looked under the hood. And I think most manufacturers are not going to let folks look under the hood because you have to disclose every single line item and cost of the components going into your product. We've communicated, the Novogradac Tax Credit Working Group has communicated very clearly to the and forthrightly to IRS leadership, Treasury leadership of the fact that this is not so workable, to which they said, we hear you, and remember, it's meant to be a bonus. So there you go. That's when I said, I'm going to focus on what PSEF folks really want to focus on, which is the low-income credits. So you either get a 10% credit or the 20% credit, if at all. Category 1 are for projects located in a low-income community, for which actually a significant portion of Category 1 is actually reserved for behind-the-meter projects, so smaller projects like we've been talking about, so 560, I think it is, megawatts, or Category 2 located on Indian land. And why am I talking about megawatts here when I didn't under domestic content bonus or energy communities? Because the low-income bonus credit, 10 or 20%, is of course subject to that 1.8 gigawatt per year annual capacity limitation. The IRS has told us that DOE will start accepting applications for Category 3 and 4 first for these 20% projects, for those in qualified low-income residential buildings or serving qualified low-income residential buildings, but only where the benefit is shared, the financial benefit is shared equally across the residents of those buildings. That's a key question, key issue. Category 4 has the largest of these larger of the two categories, which is the qualified low-income economic benefit. And so again, I'm just going to pick on CEF because I know they're modeled the best. So if 51% of the beneficiaries, in their case subscribers, to a low-income or to a solar project are verified as low-income households, and those households are experiencing, I believe it's a 20% economic benefit. So if somebody in the meeting can throw in a chat if you recall specifically that it's that 20% benefit, I'd appreciate it. Then you are eligible to apply for the qualified low-income economic benefit 20% adder. Note that I work with many clients who put solar on the roofs of qualified low-income single-family homeowners, or that have done rooftop installations that connect to individual apartments. The IRS's initial guidance interpreted the term multiple households in the statute as each project must serve multiple households, when we have generated something like 60 comments urging them to see that if the requirement is that at least half of the beneficiaries see the economic benefit, then if you're putting one on the roof of a low-income homeowner, aren't you giving 100% of the benefit to the same household? So let's hope that they see the wisdom there. But there is, these rules and implementation things really matter. But you can see that adding these together, 50%, 60%, I don't think we're going to see many, 70% projects, but it's possible and can be quite advantageous. I have not yet seen any project secure a term sheet or close on a tax equity partnership above 30%, because the IRS is still finishing out those rules. I do believe we're going to see projects lock in 40, 50, 70, 60, 70% at some point this year. But the one thing I have to caution all y'all on, if you have projects that are almost ready for the low-income bonus credit, you cannot place your project in service until you have gone through the application process and have an allocation letter from the IRS. I see Crystal going, oh, if I can pick on you for a second. You're exactly right. That was like when I first saw this guidance, I went, okay, make sure everyone knows this. We now have to work on what that means. Now, I have some clients that have some grants that require the projects be completed. And so we can complete the projects, just not place them in service. So in other words, test them, get final inspection, et cetera. And then they've actually then, of course, turned the switch back off, locked it in the off position, and then gotten permission, gotten amendments to the grant agreement to recognize that they just need to hold tight for a little bit. DOE is going to be running this application process, most likely NREL, but not for sure. And we do expect that the window should open in July or August. There'll be a deadline date, and then they'll start to go through applications. And, I could talk ad nauseum on this stuff, but I'll just say very, very quickly, you can imagine how in these categories, we could exceed the capacity, right? Applications at that deadline could exceed the capacity for 2023, especially. And so if there are excess applications, the IRS and DOE will actually apply these additional selection criteria, meaning to sort of create a prioritization within each category. So nonprofits, smaller cooperatives, I can't remember all of the lists in the additional selection criteria, but if you meet both criteria, 2 out of 4 or 5 criteria, then you are in the top tier, and they'll go through those applications first, then go to those that meet one of the criteria, and then go to the rest. And then once they've done all categories 4, 3, 2, and 1, with 2 and 1 coming second in the batch, if there's capacity left over, say in category 1, but lots of extra applications in category 3, then under the law, the IRS and DOE can reallocate some of those. So we may not know until December 20th the status of some credit program. So it's not ideal. It's part of the growing pains of a really positive development. So I'm going to take 5 more minutes, if that's okay, to drill in on the mechanics of the elected payment and a couple of other little things, and then we'll work through some questions. So how do we access the elected payment? So the first thing is, just like the for-profit credit, you have to own the solar asset for at least 5 years. And if you don't, you will get recapture penalties, which are 100% in the first year, 80% in the second, 60, 40, 20. So it's not like you can own it in the first year and be done and sell it to someone else. So if you remember the partnership flip structure that we often use, where the project gets sold to the host maybe in the 7th year, imagine that the only thing different here is that you as a nonprofit entity are going to own and operate the systems. I talked about the tax, what entities are eligible. You, of course, don't get to deduct any depreciation benefit because you have to have a for-profit tax burden in order to offset the depreciation expenses. But at 30% and even 50%, it's definitely worth making this work, because now all of a sudden we have a 50% cash grant in effect, and you only need to borrow for the other 50%, although you have to imagine the timing. So let's talk about how you access it. Even entities that are exempt from 990s, which is the tax exempt organization tax return. So states, municipalities, faith organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, everyone is going to be claiming the credit has to file the 990T form, and then also file the 3468 and 3800 forms that you file today or in 2022, a tax for-profit tax credit claimant would file. It's a process where the first thing you do is you pre-register the intention to get the payment, and then you actually register your application for the specific project. So it's like PSEF, if you were the owner, PSEF would say, hey, we're a Massachusetts nonprofit with 501c3 designation. We intend to take the 6417 elective payment. And it may even be for the specific project. I can't remember that mechanic. And then when the project is placed in service, then we'll file and include the forms, and on the same portal, file for that specific parcel. So you can imagine that parcel numbers are going to be really important to prevent fraud. 6417 eligible entities cannot transfer a credit. Does that make sense? So PSEF could only have a third party own and operate the system or take elective payment itself. PSEF could not own a project and then sell the credit. It makes lots of sense about why, but we'll just leave it at that. Oh, you do get a property specific number. I should read my own slides. There will be reporting, annual reporting, pretty manageable annual reporting as part of the anti-fraud and anti-abuse measures and to prevent recapture penalties. There's one more special rule to be aware of, and that is that the total of grants, tax-exempt grants, and the credit cannot exceed $1 million. And the first is not actually a special rule, it's a general rule, which is that all federal funds reduce that basis for calculating the credit. So $1 million project that got $200,000 federal funds would actually have a basis of $800,000 times 30% to make the $240,000 credit, right? Because you can't double dip. Can't get federal funds and then get a tax credit against those federal funds. That's like black letter tax credit law that's been in place for a very long time. Here's where things have gotten complicated. If I get a $750,000 grant, not a loan, unless it's a forgivable loan under very certain circumstances, but let's call it just a raw grant. Kresge doesn't give us a loan, they give us a $750,000 grant for the specific purpose of installing, constructing, and purchasing the equipment. And we have $1 million project cost that would normally be eligible for that $300,000 basis. Well, the tax or $300,000 credit, that tax credit and the amount of the grant cannot exceed the project cost. If it does, then the credit is reduced. So it's only 100,000 or 100% together. So the credit in this case would be reduced from 300,000 to 250,000. I have a client that received 100% of their low-income single-family residential project financing as a grant from their state energy program. the specific purpose of those grants is no longer the construction, installation, and equipment, but is, like they do in Washington, D.C. under the Solar for All program, a prepaid lease on behalf of those participating homeowners. You can imagine the panic that I had for that client when I read the new rule. Back to the low-income bonus credit real quick, and then we can take some questions. So to apply for these behind-the-meter projects, the low-income bonus credit program, or all the other smaller projects we've been talking about, just to apply, you have to have an executed PPA, solar lease, or a purchase agreement for the solar project itself. So this is not to place the project in service. This is just to get into that application process for that allocation, right? At 1.8 gigawatt allocation. You do then have to attest that you've obtained all the permits that are non-ministerial, so like construction permits, that you've complied with all federal, state, local laws, including consumer protection laws, that the project is not going to be meet more than 110% of historical load. Now in Minnesota, the utility limit is 120%. We've asked the IRS to, in final rule, bump that up to align with what most states do, and that you've actually inspected the sites for suitability. That's not going to be a problem for us, because you all are going to be out there touching, the installations really well. Some will be just throwing applications in, so they will be committing fraud if you say that you have inspected the site for suitability, when if you've just looked up on Google Earth, that's not going to be enough. For the federally supported housing projects, you have to document that the solar is going to be installed on those specific buildings that meet the federal requirement, and that the benefit is going to be shared equally across tenants. How that's determined, we can have a side conversation, or you can read 40 pages of documents that start to outline it. And then I mentioned these sort of prioritization within the applications. You'll need to demonstrate via documentation that you meet those additional ownership criteria. And then finally, when you apply for the project, when the project's placed in service, you're going to have to declare these items A through F, among others, that nothing's substantially changed. You've got permission to operate or something similar. You've documented the system was built as designed. PE, there's a professional engineer, for those that don't know. That you have a benefit sharing agreement for the federal multifamily properties, or the final list of participating households and how you verified income, and showing that the financial benefits exceed 20% to those participants. Yes, it was 20%. I got that right. So lastly, I'll just say, why is this so complicated? Why couldn't Congress get it right? And I'll just say, in terms of process, I've served in the legislature, worked for administration, worked for secretaries of energy. Politics is about working with your colleagues, begging and pleading for your chairs, et cetera, to get to 50%. And this is when I served. You can see how white the Minnesota legislature was then. Thank God it's very, very different in this 15 years. But, when you get Joe Manchin to say yes, and you get to 50 votes, you have to take a vote. As soon as you have the votes, you take the vote. Because otherwise the Bernie Sanders, how do you keep Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin in the same coalition? When everyone's at yes, you vote yes. So there wasn't time to go to Treasury, IRS, DOE, to us, the community, to stakeholders, and test things out. And so a lot of what's happening now is things were brought off the shelf, and then some language was like, we're going to get the best we can, and we just need to take the votes. And so if you're ever frustrated about why the Inflation Reduction Act sucks in some ways, legal term, it's because of the politics is the art of the possible. And when you get it right, maybe sometimes you can celebrate, which is what I really hope that we get to do all along. And I'm already seeing a lot of reasons to celebrate. So.